Yep. So we've done Michigan, we've done national. Let's jump into some other national news.
Well, let me bring in, we have another panelist here. Let's introduce Shay Bonhag, who is an active member of our volunteer team. Shay, thanks for joining us this afternoon. And let's find out what Sarah has picked out for topics of discussion.
We're going to start with term limit amendments. I don't know if you're aware, but there was a term limit amendment introduced in Congress by Ted Cruz. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas introduced a term limit amendment into Congress that would limit U.S. senators to 2 to 6 year terms and U.S. representatives to 3 to 2 year terms. In a statement released on his official website, Cruz.senate.gov, Senator Cruz is quoted saying, "Term limits are critical to fixing what's wrong with Washington, D.C. The founding fathers envisioned a government of citizen legislators who would serve for a few years and return home, not a government run by a small group of special interests and lifelong, permanently entrenched politicians who prey upon the brokenness of Washington to govern in a manner that is totally unaccountable to the American people. Term limits bring about long overdue accountability. I urge my colleagues to advance this amendment to the state so that it may be quickly ratified and become a constitutional amendment." Representative Norman, who also reportedly supported the resolution, is quoted saying, "Elected officials should represent a short-term privilege of public service, not a career choice. Those of us in Congress ought to serve for a reasonable period of time and then return home to live under the laws we enacted. That's why I proposed a constitutional amendment to establish term limits in the legislative branch. And I am honored that Senator Cruz has introduced a companion bill over in the Senate. This effort will go a long way to positively impact American politicians, and I appreciate Senator Cruz's leadership in this important issue." What I would pose to our panelists, Senator Cruz has introduced a term limits amendment into Congress at least 4 times.
Yeah.
Why do you think this amendment never makes it out of Congress?
They're not interested in making any changes that are going to disrupt their own personal status quo. That's my 2 cents worth. We've waited and waited.
What do you think, Shay?
Well, I'm in the same boat. You can introduce these things, but in order to overcome any filibuster and so forth, you need 60 votes in the Senate, and chances are you're not going to get 60 votes to overturn. And in the House, maybe you could get it passed, but you still have the hurdle of 38 states have to agree. So, I mean, just the fact that they pass a bill that then starts the clock or starts working on the getting states to ratify doesn't mean that it's going to happen. I mean, there's just I like the spirit. The spirit's the right idea. He's got the right conversation going, and he sounds a lot like COS in some senses. The term limits should be short and have a defined limit. So.
Yeah.
But his proposal is just one proposal. There's probably a myriad of proposals out there, and if we get a COS convention going, you guarantee there are going to be a whole lot of conversations about what that amendment should look like, and it's not going to be the senators. Sorry, but it's not going to be the senator's solution. It's going to be something else that comes out of that. So he's really preventing a lot of discussion around it. And again, what Robin said is right. This is not in their best interest long term.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think we tend to overlook when we're looking at Congress the fact that it's the state legislators that actually have to approve this. And so they're going to approve it from their vantage point of what term limits should be. Now, in Michigan, we have combined term limits of 12 years, meaning that the senators and representatives can serve a total of 12 years. It doesn't matter which chamber they spend those in. They could spend, 4 in the Senate and 8 in the House, or any combination that they can do with their 2s and 4 year services. But that's less than technically what Cruz is proposing. He's proposing 12 for Senate and 6 for House. That's really short on House. But even with the 12 years combined that we have in Michigan, one of the main arguments we've heard from legislators why they aren't a fan of term limits is they feel that it has given more power to the bureaucracy, because they aren't term limited. They can stick around for whole year careers, and you end up with a situation where they have all this knowledge of how things function and the legislators have to lean on them. So that's kind of an interesting perspective that I think the state legislators that will end up voting on these things ultimately bring to the table.
Yep.
What do you think would be the strength of, and you've kind of touched on this a little bit already, Shay, but what do you think the strength would be in the Article 5 process for finding a term limit solution? I should say the Article 5 Convention of States process,
right.
For finding a term limit solution the American people could all agree on, over, say, Congress proposing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of the convention is it allows delegates from each state to negotiate and talk about what those term limits ought to be and come up with some conclusion about how it should be done. So there's a real advantage of having that communication, and that's not happening now. So that's what we need the COS in place. We need to have that conversation on not just term limits, but all the components of COS.
Mm-hmm.
And you're missing it if you don't have that conversation.
Yeah. Robin, do you have any thoughts?
No, I just want to say that we do have some commenters coming in on the chat who basically concur with what's being said. Reinstate the need for this, and also the assurance that 38 states still have to ratify this. None of this stuff is easy. It's not going to be done by a minority of people. And I wish I had the report accessible, but we've seen in the research, the independent research that was done in the last year, Americans want term limits.
They do.
In overwhelming majorities. It's like 85%.
Mm-hmm.
That is the will of the people.
If you could get the state representatives to get together and talk that through and figure out what would be palatable and reasonable to put in place, it seems to me that takes you a long way toward the 38 states agreeing, right? Because you've at least got probably that many sitting in the room saying that's what we're agreeing to that. They have to sell it back to their states, of course, but it helps a long way.
I can imagine that when a convention happens, this is going to be an energetic discussion.
Oh, yes.
To hash this out and what the numbers are. And I've been personally asked about that. And sure, I have my own opinions. I'm not sure they're what a convention would come with, but it's certainly something more in the lines of in that 12 to 20 years instead of these lifetimes where people are actually dying from old age while they're serving.
Oh yeah, or in nursing homes.
Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that we are dealing with these different components. On the one hand, we have the public that would love to see people in and out in 6 years. And then you have the people who are actually trying to do the job in 6 years who say, we can't figure out how to make the system work in 6 years.
Right.
We need more time. And I think if you have an actual convention, everyone has to understand you're not going to get 6 years and you're not going to get 40 years. You're probably going to end up having to go with something right down the middle so that both camps are happy. And our simulated conventions have kind of indicated that as well. When you actually get the legislators in the room, because we have to have 3/4 of the states agree on this. And that's a large majority, which means you're going to have a lot of diverse opinions. And you're going to need some people who are anti-term limits to come along with you. And what we found, I think, 2 years ago was, and I wish I had it in front of me, but I don't. I think they ended up with an amendment where it was something like 18-year limit per chamber, but then 26-year limit overall, something like that, which granted is a whole lot more than 6 and 12 like Ted Cruz is proposing. But at the same time, it's also a whole lot less than life. And I think there's a lot of conversation to be had around that. I don't think that'll necessarily end up being what you end up with, but I think it's a good indication of the direction these conversations may take in the future.
Right.
It's going to be fun.
Absolutely.